Carbon Markets Forum. Welcome everybody. I'm hoping a few more people will drift in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the emerging landscape of standards and regulations, particularly around voluntary carbon markets. The reason we're focusing on voluntary carbon markets today is not because I or anybody else who I work with believes that voluntary carbon markets are a panacea for all the world's climate ills, far from it. But we are in a situation where governments promised $100 billion a year to support mitigation and adaptation in developing countries in 2009, and we only first reached that in 2023, and we know that that is significantly less than is needed to drive both mitigation and adaptation in the developing world. The IMF estimates $2 trillion a year by 2030, the IEA up to $3 trillion a year. So we need something to bridge the gap between the climate finance that's available now and what is really needed over the next 5 years. We know that the Paris Agreement mechanisms are still being negotiated. We know that broader climate finance is not growing. I defy anybody to tell me that at 11:30 Claire Coutinho is going to stand up on stage and make her election pitch a $1 trillion gift of the UK government to support mitigation and development around the world. So we're relying on the private sector, and the IMF in that $2 trillion figure suggested that 80% of that was going to have to come from the private sector in one form or another, whether that be direct investment, carbon markets, or some other approach. So hence focusing on the emerging voluntary carbon market and the standards and regulations that are emerging to bring integrity to it. And integrity is obviously the key issue. Many of you will have seen how until about 2020-21, the market suddenly took off, and it looked like there was going to be a boom in voluntary carbon markets. We had a number of highly reputable strategic consultants telling us that it was going to be worth anything between $50 billion and $1 trillion a year within the next 20 to 25 years. But since then, we've seen the market plagued, maybe plagued is the wrong word, but a plethora of concerns about the market, both on the supply side, the integrity of credits. Do carbon credits really represent a ton of carbon? Concerns about the impacts on local communities, the extent to which benefits are being shared with host countries and host communities. And on the demand side, concerns that companies may be either making misleading claims. Many of you will have seen how KLM was pulled through the mill over the last few weeks in Dutch courts about its claims about the sustainability of its aviation, and also whether use of carbon credits is delaying or impeding decarbonisation. So VCMI, my organisation, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, was set up 3 years ago by then COP26 President Alok Sharma, with the aim of bringing integrity and scale to voluntary carbon markets, with the idea that those two are not oppositional, but one requires the other. If we're going to build scale, then we need to have trust, and trust will be founded on a basis of integrity. So we do two things. One, we create standards for buyers of carbon credits so that they can be sure that what they're doing follows the broadly accepted mitigation hierarchy, and that they are not going to be attacked for using carbon credits, but rather, we hope, rewarded and lauded for doing so. And we also work with developing country governments, those countries that are hosting carbon projects, to ensure that carbon credits don't just become another tropical soft commodity. I lived in Ecuador for many years. Ecuador is occasionally the world's largest exporter of bananas. When it's doing very well, then its neighboring banana producers say, the Ecuadorians are producing too much, they're exporting too much, so we will devalue our currency, reduce our labor standards, reduce our environmental standards, and then they sell more. And then it becomes a beggar my neighbor approach, where everyone is reducing standards, reducing quality, devaluing the currencies, and the only beneficiaries are those of us who buy bananas in supermarkets here and elsewhere. So we want to avoid that carbon credits follow that same pattern. So we work with host countries to help them think about how carbon finance, the money that is generated by the sale of carbon credits, can be genuinely transformational. So how can it finance technologies and support skills that wouldn't otherwise be financed? How can they use carbon finance to leverage additional flows of capital? I think one of the more realistic numbers about where the carbon market might grow to, the voluntary carbon market, is probably about $50 billion. So if we can think of a leverage factors of 4 to 5 to 6, that could leverage total finance of between $250 and $300 billion, about 10% of what is needed in 2030, therefore significant, if, as I said at the beginning, not the panacea. So I mentioned the main part of our work is to focus on demand-side standards, and this responds to a clear need in the market for consumers, shareholders, investors, companies themselves to understand what they can and cannot say about their use of carbon credits in combination with their own decarbonisation efforts. And that in combination piece is key. It's no longer good enough, as it perhaps was 20 years ago, to measure the carbon footprint of your headquarters, buy a few carbon credits to offset those emissions and claim carbon neutrality. It might have been good enough in 2005, it's certainly not good enough in 2024. So we provide guidance for companies on how they can combine their own efforts, their engagement with their supply chains and the use of carbon credits to make credible statements about their climate leadership. There are two sets of claims that we've developed. One is the carbon integrity claims. You can see on the right-hand side, silver, gold, and platinum. For those, companies are demonstrably meeting their objectives in terms of their own internal decarbonisation and decarbonising their supply chains, and then buying carbon credits to go above and beyond that. And then we've also we've developed a beta version of a Scope 3 flexibility claim, and this is the one that those of you who follow the carbon market news will have seen has been the subject of quite a lot of debate, controversy even, because what we're proposing, given that so many companies, perhaps 60 or 70% of companies who have Scope 3 targets validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative, are by their own admission not on track to hit those targets in 2030, and they're not on track every single year between now and then. So the question we've asked is, should companies who are not on track, even if they're making their best efforts, should they just go, sorry, I failed? Or should there be some obligation, some moral or some opportunity to bridge that gap with high integrity carbon credits? Not to say that those carbon credits are the same as their own decarbonisation, but to say we're taking responsibility for emissions. If a trajectory from 2020 to 2030 is not just an ideal state, but actually a limit on a company's emissions, any emissions above that should be seen as a liability. And investing in carbon credits, high integrity carbon credits, is a way of covering some of that liability. So we have the carbon integrity claims. So I just finished that. Carbon integrity claims, the first company to make one of those was Bain & Co. in February. We've got a pipeline of 5 or 6 we expect to announce over the next 2 or 3 months. Those carbon integrity claims require companies to first demonstrate they are following best practice for corporate climate action, that they have an independently validated inventory, they have a net zero commitment, they have intervening targets for 2030, 2035, etc., for all 3 scopes of their emissions. They're not just targets that their CEO announced in a fit of excitement at Davos. These are backed up by transition plans and demonstrating that CapEx and OpEx have been allocated to them. And they also have to demonstrate that they're not only walking the talk, but they're talking the walk. Their lobbying is consistent with their net zero commitment. And once they've done that, they have to demonstrate that they're making adequate progress towards their next target, often in 2030. And having done that, they cover some portion of their remaining emissions with high integrity carbon credits. Silver requires 10 to 50% of the remaining emissions, gold 50 to 99%, and platinum 100% and above. So that's a way of companies having confidence that they are buying carbon credits in a way that is considered credible by a wide range of stakeholders. We developed this in partnership with a country contact group of 55 governments, with a stakeholder forum bringing representatives from all sectors of society and the economy. So this gives companies confidence to come back into the market and say, okay, we're doing the right thing, and we're not going to be criticized for it. The VCMI claim obviously also requires, as I've mentioned several times, companies to buy high integrity carbon credits. And what do we mean by them? We look at the standards that are also merging on the supply side. Our sister organization, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, which many of you all know has developed the 10 core carbon principles to determine what constitutes a high quality credit from a high integrity project registered or issued under a high integrity standard. So these 10 core carbon principles, on the screen you can see here, they are pretty obvious. Most of you who've engaged with carbon markets will have seen these terms before. The ICVCM goes into much more detail on defining what these terms mean, but importantly has 2 assessment frameworks. One at the level of standard setters, And these are the registry bodies like Vera, like Gold Standard. The ICVCM has received applications from standards that cover 98% of the credits in the market to be accredited. And the first ones, ACR Climate Action Reserve and the Gold Standard, were accredited last month, and we're expecting the remaining ones. Each of them have had to go back and make some changes to their operating procedures, some of their governance, but all have now passed, and we expect the remaining ones to pass over the next month or 6 weeks. What does this mean? Each of these approved as CCP eligible, it means they have good independent governance. They have transparent registry systems, transparent decision-making procedures, and they have sustainable development and benefit sharing at the heart of their governance processes and methodology design. The second part of the ICVCM's assessment process, which is going on at the moment, is a lot more complicated. This is assessing every project category and every methodology that exists in the market and provides guidance for those who are developing methodologies in the future. So if you think about a project category such as avoiding deforestation or REDD+, there are a number of methodologies, and the working groups within the ICVCM at the moment are, one, assessing rules for the category as a whole, and then we'll go through methodology by methodology to see which ones meet the core carbon principles. And in the REDD+ space, that has already driven the development of new methodologies that respond to many of the concerns that you've seen in the press over the last year or two, and concerns that have been expressed by stakeholders. So even those methodologies that haven't yet been certified, we're seeing a process of continuous improvement. And VCMI's claims code requires companies to use CCP labeled credits. Those who are doing so this year, before those labels have been issued, can show that their due diligence publicly follows the core carbon principles. So there we have the two big meta standards on the supply and demand side of the market, responding partly to the concerns that have been raised over the last few months and years over the integrity in both carbon credits themselves and their use, but also because, as I said at the beginning, we recognize that while VCMs are not the panacea, without them, we're going to get even further behind where we need to be in terms of climate finance and carbon mitigation. Just imagine a couple of examples. Imagine a bit of forest, a tropical forest, which has loggers circling it. It would be nice to be able to say, let's wait 5 years until governments get their act together and pay to prevent deforestation. Those loggers aren't going to wait 5 years, and in 5 years, if the money from public money comes through, it'll be too late, the forest will be gone. Imagine a community in northern Nigeria that doesn't have access to electricity. We could say to them, wait 5 years until we raise our ODA budgets, do without electricity till then. They currently have the opportunity to bring on board a diesel generating set. We can't tell them not to have electricity. The carbon market, voluntary carbon finance, can bridge the gap between the cost of the diesel gen set and, for example, an off-grid solar system. And it can do so now. Every year that we wait and don't provide that finance, another opportunity to reduce or remove emissions is stranded. But as I say, the voluntary carbon market is not the be-all and end-all, and government engagement is going to be increasingly key, not only in the case of the Article 6 mechanisms, which I'm not going to go into detail, but I know there are sessions on later, but also providing a framework to encourage and guide voluntary carbon markets. You can see on the supply side, that vertical blue line shows what countries have put in their nationally determined contributions, what they've said they are going to deliver in terms of climate mitigation. And that blue line is the piece that will be delivered, requires external finance, of which carbon finance is a large part, to be delivered. So I gave a couple of micro examples. That's the size of the opportunity that will be missed if we don't drive finance to carbon emission reductions and removals now. Without it, we will be not close to 1.5, we'll be looking at 2.5 or 3 degrees. Again, I just want to emphasize, I'm not suggesting that voluntary carbon markets will solve all the problems, but they can fill a gap that needs to be filled now. So we need governments to provide encouragement. I'm glad to see, and maybe the Minister will talk about this later, that in its green finance strategy, the UK government is recommending that companies engage in voluntary carbon markets and follow the 2 high integrity standards I mentioned. 10 days ago, John Podesta, the Special Advisor to the White House on climate change, announced that the US was going to issue guidance for companies on using carbon credits. We're seeing similar things taking place in Australia and Singapore. So while this will not be regulated, this is after all a voluntary system, that kind of guidance from countries where buyers come from will help give confidence. And we're seeing more and more developing countries saying, we need this and we need high integrity credits because we don't want to fall into the trap of just selling off the family carbon silver on the cheap. So we need government engagement. And they can play several roles. I'm sure I'm coming to the end of my time now. I'm getting a look from my right. So government's important, but it doesn't mean we should be waiting. We can take action now. There are high quality projects in the market. The integrity system, the VCMI and ICVCM have developed their tools. On the demand side, you can make a claim now, and I'd encourage all of you who work in companies to consider doing so. If you can't make one of the carbon integrity claims, think about how you might engage with us to develop further the Scope 3 claims or other claims that might be useful to demonstrate that you as a company are combining real, genuine efforts to decarbonize your own companies, you're engaging with your supply chains, and then using carbon credits to bridge any gap. And that carbon credit has incredible value. We've seen from 3 or 4 studies over the last year that companies that are using carbon credits are on average decarbonizing internally up to twice as fast as companies that are not. And one reason for that is the establishment of a de facto carbon price by buying carbon credits can drive change internally. And if you look at any company, maybe there are some here, who set internal carbon prices, almost every time decarbonization happens more quickly and cheaper than was initially anticipated. So carbon finance, carbon credits are not a get out of jail free, they're not an indulgence, they're a way of driving internal change while contributing to overall global mitigation. And we're seeing more and more this is being picked up by governments. And governments may be picking it up in part because we are, after all, collectively failing on our responsibilities, but also because they recognize that this is an effective way of leveraging private capital to where it's needed most in a way that is nimble, that is not overly burdened by regulation, but can drive real finance and real change at scale. So on that I will leave you. There are some QR codes if you're interested in finding out about more VCMI's work, or even more importantly and excitingly, you want to make a VCMI claim. Scan here, find me afterwards, happy to talk to you more. Thanks very much indeed.